Hey friends, Brian Doak here. I hold in my hands a copy of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament in Hebrew. That's what it looks like. This is called the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. It's the kind of standard edition that scholars use to read the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew. It has a lot of technical notes and it's just the basic format that we use. Here's a great question to kind of kick things off. What do you call this thing, this corpus of words and books? Which Christians call the Old Testament. By the way, why do Christians call it the Old Testament, and where did that term come from? As far as I understand, the term came from a Christian leader, a kind of an early bishop in the Christian church who lived from about 100 to 280, something like that, in what is modern-day Turkey, or Turkiye, as I think they want us to call it, according to, which I learned at the Olympics this year. And this particular bishop was apparently the first to use the term Old Testament to refer to what essentially by that time had more or less become the Bible or the Holy Scripture or the basic set of inspired writings for Jews, which is where we would get a term like Hebrew Bible. So Hebrew Bible would be a kind of ecumenical term that we could use today, a term that's very open to others. Which doesn't so much call this set of writings the Old Testament as in something that's old, as in something that's been superseded, right? So the word old has a connotation that's maybe not just quite happened a long time ago. I mean, the New Testament happened a long time ago too, right? Not just older than that, but rather something that's been superseded, something that's been overwritten, something that's been consigned to the dustbin, to the trash bin, right? These are negative ways you could take the phrase Old Testament. I'm not sure that the earliest usage of that term had that in mind, but it certainly could lend itself to that. And there's certainly a history that Christians have to deal with of what we might call Christian supersessionism. This idea that somehow, in its popular form, the Jews used to be God's chosen people, but then Jesus came and now Christians are God's chosen people, replacing the Jews who are now, right? And you can read the book of Romans in the New Testament for some very complex and at times ambiguous even commentary on this dynamic, wherein on the one hand, Paul seems to say, and in some of his other letters, something that sounds very much like that supersessionist view, and then in other places, things that sound very much not like that supersessionist view at all. The idea that, as Paul says in Romans, all Israel will be saved, or something like that. And yet now Christians are the new spiritual Israel, but not the literal Israel. You know, it's like, I'm not a New Testament scholar, so I can't sort that out for you. My point was to say that the phrase Hebrew Bible, at least as an open phrase, acknowledges that this thing is actually still the Bible for Jews, as a complete unit, not old or not superseded by, in Christian Bibles, a New Testament, which is then joined onto the Old Testament. In fact, in the history of religions, there aren't too many examples. Christianity may even be a kind of unique, interesting example of a religion or a new movement that basically took the canon, or the set of authoritative writings, from another group entirely, and basically adopted it as its own canon and then added another piece to it, namely the so-called Christian writings, which could be an ecumenical term for the New Testament. You could call them the Christian writings. I've heard people use phrases like First Testament and Second Testament. So First Testament might even seem to prioritize then the so-called Old Testament as something that comes first, both chronologically and as a theological foundation or base. When people say First Testament and Second Testament, this is just me, I'm just putting myself out there, it feels like they're trying a little too hard to sort of like solve this problem through their language. I'm all about solving problems through language. For instance, there's a tweak on a Bible translation called the NRSV UE Updated Edition, which basically takes some of the language in the NRSV, like the word slave, like this person became a slave, or there were slaves, and changes it to enslaved. So the idea being that slave is not an ontological category. Some people are just slaves. That's just what they were born to be. It's what they are, as opposed to this adjective or this other kind of phrase, enslaved, meaning the slavery was something that was done to a person, not something that the person is. I think that's a beautiful language change. I totally support it, and I've tried to move over to it and to use it when I talk about slavery, rather talking about enslaved persons, etc. So I'm all about that. To me, I don't know, maybe I'm just getting a little older, maybe it's just my traditional way of speaking, but to say First Testament and Second Testament, or Hebrew scriptures and Christian scriptures, those terms are okay. If you use them with me, I'm totally okay with it. But I don't mind the Christian term Old Testament because I know what I mean by it and I know what I don't mean by it. But if I were in mixed company of any kind, and certainly in my educational journey or in scholarly company, I would definitely say Hebrew Bible, because Hebrew Bible has just become like a very common term now that people use, especially scholars in the field of Old Testament. Sometimes, maybe even in writing, you'll see Old Testament / Hebrew Bible, which is a very long way of saying, yes, I recognize that some people are Christians and would just call this the Old Testament in a familiar way, but also maybe in ecumenical context, we would call it the Hebrew Bible. Okay. Words matter, and I've given you at least a few options here. Another phrase that you might see used sometimes, particularly by Jews today, would be the phrase Tanakh, Tanakh, usually spelled. It's a kind of a vocalized acronym for the Torah, T, that's where you get the Ta, and then the Nevi'im, or the prophets, that's where you get the N, and then the K at the end would be the Ketuvim, the writings. These are the three traditional divisions of the Hebrew Bible. The Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then the Nevi'im, which includes the former prophets and the latter prophets, so Joshua, Judges, the Samuels, and the Kings, and then all the named prophetic books. Notice that I left Ruth out of there in the Jewish ordering because really Ruth comes in the writings, yes, the Ketuvim, at the very end. So there you have, and including Daniel. So Daniel's actually not in the Nevi'im in Jewish Bibles, but rather in the Ketuvim, the writings. So you can kind of kick Daniel out of the prophets. Of course, Daniel's an important prophet for Christians, so you see a little bit of the debate there, the issue. But anyway, the Ketuvim would be things like Proverbs and Psalms and Job and Ezra and Nehemiah and those kind of books. Ending in Chronicles, which in Christian Bibles are typically sandwiched right next to Kings, but in Jewish Bibles actually come at the end of the Bible. So in a way, when we talk about the Hebrew Bible versus the Old Testament, we're actually talking about two different documents, not in terms of the words and the books. For Christians and for Jews, the contents of the so-called Old Testament, apart from the apocryphal or deuterocanonical writings, apart from that, the contents of the Old Testament are the same, with a crucial difference, the ordering of the books. In the Jewish canon, Chronicles actually comes last. And there's a kind of forward-looking and also backward-looking resolution that the end of Chronicles offers an audience, or a reader, if you read it straight through like a novel, that in the Christian Bible you get a totally different kind, ending with Malachi, with the promise of an Elijah-like figure who will come, which makes a nice bridge into, of course, the New Testament with a figure like John the Baptist, who is symbolically or typologically or otherwise linked to Elijah, John the Baptist and Elijah, and then Jesus as well. So in a sense, whether you say Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, you're actually talking about two different books. Typically, when we're not that nuanced with our language, and for people who don't know about these differences, they wouldn't be, using Old Testament or Hebrew Bible as one term over the other. You typically wouldn't hear Jews saying Old Testament, just like you don't typically hear average Christians in the pew saying Hebrew Bible. I use the terms interchangeably in common language, but when speaking with more directed or specific audiences, I would either use Old Testament, like in a Christian church setting, so as not to confuse people, like the Hebrew Bible, are you talking about something else? And then you have to explain the ordering of the books and all the things I'm saying here. And then around scholars, or certainly in mixed company, I say Hebrew Bible because that's just the tradition and that's the way it's done. Tanakh, I don't hear a lot of people saying Tanakh. Maybe Jews in synagogue and in conversation would say Tanakh as an abbreviation for the whole thing. I don't hear a lot of Christians using that term, and I don't use it very often. But just so you know, it's a term. First Testament, Second Testament, feels like it's trying too hard. That's just my take on it. Christian scriptures and Hebrew scriptures, that's okay. Hebrew Bible and New Testament are normal ways. And in the scholarly circles, calling New Testament, I think is pretty much the way. So it's like, if you have a New Testament, then do you have an Old Testament? Okay. Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, are we talking about the same corpus of books? Yes. We're actually talking about a different ordering, though, and a very different theological outlook from Christians versus Jews on those books when we use a phrase like Old Testament versus Hebrew Bible.